Alright, welcome back to the channel. Today we're discussing training methodologies. I'm going to take you guys through a bit of a timeline and show you some contrasting methodologies and schools of training, and hopefully get to condense everything and show you that oftentimes what we see throughout the years is that the answer lies somewhere in the middle. So we'll first talk about the weightlifting system by the Soviets, and most of the information is going to come from this book right here, Managing the Training of Weightlifters by Laputin and Oleshko. You can pick it up from actually the Westside Library in their translated version. The weightlifting system was a very well-structured method of training. Okay, it was a state-funded program, I think, for the most part, and the whole goal of that department was to essentially create a system that would allow them to go out, find kids that had the ideal characteristics and show to have the best traits for the sport, put them through a system and turn them into world champions. You know, it was a very basic style of training because they determined the 3 stages that every athlete had to go through in their competitive season. These were the growth of trainability, the achievement of sporting form, and the decrease in trainability. So it's interesting to see that they understood that their athletes, who most of them were world-class athletes, couldn't hold that level of conditioning year long. And it was a natural part of the progressions to essentially come down from those peaks and have to train back up into a trainability state, into a sporting form, and go into competition once again. You know, they were known for using lesser intensities, and they were very, very big on volume and technical proficiency. The entire Soviet model was based on that, technical proficiency and work at lower intensities. By lower intensities, I mean 70 to 80%. And they ran some studies with 800 athletes over 2 competitive periods and determined that the ideal range of training was 85% for most of their athletes. Think about the fact that those athletes at the elite level under the Soviet system were lifting around 20,000 lifts per year, and only 500 of those were above 90%, which represents about 2 to 3%. They came out with things like the Philippines chart, which determines the ideal rep ranges and intensities for each level. They were the pioneers of the scientific method to training. Now let's contrast this to the Bulgarian method, the Bulgarian system of weightlifting. Most of the information that I'm going to present here, I've gotten through Max Ada, through his YouTube videos, and I've also attended the Coaches Only seminars from Weightlifting House that he's been a part of. So if you want to hear more about this in more detail, go watch those videos. I'll link some of them below. But the Bulgarian method was essentially created by Ivan Abajev, and it was a response in some sort of way. I mean, I'm speculating here, but it was very clearly the exact opposite of the Soviet style of training. You know, he was brought up under the Soviet training method, like most coaches in Bulgaria were, but he slowly started gravitating towards higher intensities and more specific type of work. At first he received a lot of criticism, but eventually he managed to find his way as a head coach for the national team. Apparently everybody else was just okay, if you're gonna keep talking about this stuff, go ahead and prove it to us that your methods are superior. And if you were to write a bullet point list about the characteristics of each system and put them side by side, they would be exact opposites. He got rid of all variability, which is a huge component of the Soviet system, and determined that the only thing that the athletes needed to do was the competition lifts and the front squat. So snatch, clean and jerk, and the front squat. Okay, there was no phases to the system. You essentially train the same way every day. And no work at lower intensities and barely any work about technical proficiency. He didn't care about technical proficiency. So the system was just maxing out on a daily basis and trying to beat your previous numbers every day that you're training. No deloads, no nothing before competition. If these athletes showed up to competition and managed to get within 5 kilograms of the best lift and still win, that was seen as a good thing under his eyes. He took it as his system being superior and his athletes being mentally and physically stronger than everybody else. Okay, an important thing to mention here is that he was not building weightlifters. Okay, he was not teaching people how to become weightlifters. He was essentially being fed the best that Bulgaria had to offer, and he put him through this regimen and essentially exposed the select few that were just genetically elite. Another fun fact here is when I was coming up and learning Olympic weightlifting, I was taught that the Bulgarian system was more of an RPE based style of training. So your daily maxes was just the best that you had. Okay, this is not the case. It was based on absolutes. The real thing was based on absolutes. So your max weights were the weights that you were trying to lift that particular day. It wasn't the best that you had on an RP of 9. No, it was just your best lift. That's what you're going for. Misses didn't matter how you feel. You just need to train to that number. So I think this is interesting because we see these like contrasting ideologies that both show a lot of success. But let's talk about like the key missing part here, which is just the use of PEDs and steroids throughout these years. Like both of these nations were guilty of this.
Abajev was giving each lifter 180 Dianabol tablets of 5 milligrams per week. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday were 40 pill days, and Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday were 20 pill days. They were also being injected with the steroid Ritabalil. What's that?
Decadebol classic.
Yeah, Decadebol.
So it has been proven that steroids will generate muscle even in untrained individuals, okay? And a lot of the volume arguments have been sort of debunked, or like that's, I guess, the main argument against using volume as your main source of like training progressions, is the fact that when you're on steroids, it's going to work. But now we know that as natural athletes, we usually need to have exposure to high intensities. It is a normal part of our progressions, and it's a healthy part of our progressions, and it can generate a lot of good adaptations. Okay, but trying to keep up with the schedule and the progressions that the Bulgarians use without PEDs would be virtually impossible. So it's pretty hard to compare and determine which of these methods was superior, because it's like you essentially nowadays know that we need to be taking things from both of them. We need exposure to high intensities, but technical proficiency and volume should be a part of your training because it allows you to stay well conditioned throughout the season. Which brings me up to the next topic, which is Westside Barbell. Now, Westside Barbell is a powerlifting gym, for those that don't know, and they're pretty well known for high intensity work and max out efforts. You know, they compete in powerlifting, which is just like a fucking tough sport, and the only thing you fucking do is max out like 9 times in each competition. But what's interesting, if you look at the history, if you watch the documentaries that they put out, you see that in the beginning, yeah, they were like very Bulgarian-esque type of crew, just training as hard as they could, as often as they could, and doing decently well, you know. But it was through Lewis' sort of like leadership that he started realizing, it's like, okay, I've gotten injured twice now, spine injuries both times. The people around me are also getting injured. Okay, something's got to change. And what we essentially came up with was the fact that the linear type of periodization that was very popular in the US, meaning that as the weights got heavier, the reps went down, was flawed in the sense that, yeah, people were getting stronger, but they were also getting detrained. You know, because compound movements are great at developing strength and neurological adaptations, which are needed to become stronger, but they're pretty bad at helping us generate or maintain general physical preparedness. Not to mention the fact that these big compound movements are really good at generating adaptations for the bigger muscle groups like your quads, your glutes, your chest, your back, but they're not the best at helping us attack the weaknesses in all those smaller muscles that help us stabilize and keeping us safe throughout the whole range of motion. That's one of the things that we get with volume training and training at lower intensities. So he actually went back through Soviet literature and started incorporating a lot of those methods. You know, the dynamic effort and the repetition method, as well as a lot of GPP work. And he managed to put those all together, allowing their athletes to stay as healthy as they could throughout the season, while still driving the results up on the max intensity aspect. Which I think is super interesting because you see someone who trained mainly on this high intensity stuff, like the Bulgarians did, and they managed to like come up with a better system by bringing in other aspects from like the other end of the spectrum. And that's something kind of like what bodybuilding will have done through the years, I guess, because back in the day it was the same thing. People thought that volume was the answer to everything. If you wanted to be a professional bodybuilder, you had to put in like 2 hours, like 2-3 hour sessions every day in the gym. Like Arnold was known for doing that, just a lot of volume training, okay? Of course, PEDs play a part in this, like I mentioned, and you probably will see results if you're using PEDs. But when Mike Menzer came into the picture, he sort of debunked that and said that there is no logic to this. Where does it end? Like if 5 sets are better than 3, why not do 10? Why not do 20? Like where does it end? Like if you're putting 6 hours in the gym, do you really need to start adding more volume in order to continue to improve? And what he came up with was like the science of bodybuilding according to him, and he was just training to failure, training as hard as fucking possible, which I think is like slightly ironic because it's like if you read through his book, like he wanted to take the most scientific and methodical approach to bodybuilding as possible, essentially. And what he came up with was this training to failure and training at the highest intensities possible. Okay, I think it works out in bodybuilding just because it's a different type of adaptation that we're after. But the main point that I want to get across here is just like, nowadays we understand that a lot of the stuff that he was saying was correct. You know, towards the end of his career, he got a little crazy saying that you don't need to train like once a week for 45 minutes to see like the best results. Like, that's a little too much. But now we know that high intensity work is important in your development, like I said earlier, especially for like natural athletes. You need exposure to these high intensities, okay? And as a coach, our job is essentially to start merging these ideologies from like volume and intensity and how we can find the ideal point in which the best results will be achieved in the shortest amount of time possible. Finally, I have one last example from the endurance world, and this is from Hinshaw. I've talked to him in a few other videos, and I went to a seminar like a couple weeks ago. He states that back when he was training and competing very hard, he relied on volume, nothing but volume, absurd amount of volume, okay, in the endurance world aerobically, because he was a triathlete. This led to a myriad of issues with his, not health, but his body. Like towards the end of his career, according to him, he could make himself run an Ironman at a pretty decent level. You know, he's got 2 second place world championships, but he would struggle going downstairs. And a lot of these issues with his like muscles and like a lot of like little tweaks and pains, they didn't get better until he started doing CrossFit. You know, and for the first time in his life, he actually started putting some thought and effort into high intensity work. So now he has a more holistic approach to training. He knows the importance of like high intensity work, regardless of what your discipline is. You know, he was an endurance runner. And apparently he PR'd his mile like a couple weeks ago at like 60 years old, which is fucking wild. Oftentimes we see, especially in social media, the results coming from like different training camps, different training schools, but we just see the people who succeed while using that. We don't see what's behind the doors. We don't see the people who things don't work for. So what we end up seeing oftentimes is people who are either in PEDs or who are just part of a genetically elite group. The Bulgarian system and the Soviet system did that. They exposed the elites and the genetically gifted, you know, and also use exogenous hormones to like aid in that, which who knows, maybe on top of selecting the genetically elite, they also select the highest like the best responders to exogenous hormones. And it just like propelled this like era of weightlifting. You know, like the IWF keeps changing weight classes because we can't break some of those records. Like that's how strong these people were back then, okay? But this system, Abajev was being fed the best that the nation had to offer. The Soviets went out of their way to go find these kids who just like meant to be weightlifters, and they put them through the systems and they gave them the drugs, you know, and they got the results. Same thing in bodybuilding. When we talk about volume training, like a lot of those guys were on PEDs. You know, that's why I love the Westside Barbell like argument, because those guys were open about their PED use.
Big fat redheaded kid says, I want to be the world's strongest man. What do? I said, you get as big as you can, you take all the drugs you can. He says, all right. He did.
They were like, yeah, you have to fucking use it. What are you talking about? You know, and even them realized it's like, okay, well, this high intensity stuff is kind of hurting us, and it doesn't matter if we win this competition if we can't compete for the next year. Okay, and what they end up doing was merging these ideologies, these methodologies, and creating like the conjugate training system that we know nowadays. Okay, most bodybuilders nowadays, at least what I'm seeing, is just like they take part into both high intensity work and volume training. Like they know the importance of like staying healthy and staying fit, because at the end of the day, you're an athlete as well. You know, and I threw in the endurance example there because it's like that's on the complete opposite spectrum of everything. You know, and still we have people saying it's like, no, you need both. That you can just rely on one thing. Yeah, so in conclusion, like, how do we draw these lines? How do we determine where we are? How do we examine like our current shape, the current shape of our athletes? And I think that's where like science-based training comes into play, you know, and having a good understanding, a well-nurtured understanding of like human physiology and training progressions and training history. You know, like Andrew Huberman has said in several of his podcasts that research tends to be 10 years behind like actual practical applications, you know, and it is the case when it comes to training that a lot of the things that we know for a fact now are first discovered in the gym, and years later people do research and figure out how they end up working. I think it's important to like learn from history and learn from this like people who came before us, and also having a good understanding of human physiology helps quite a bit, you know, and taking a methodical approach to what you're doing, you know, even if it's just putting some thought into it. Like I am not trying to tell people to go all in and have to schedule everything like months in advance and be stopped essentially from doing anything until I figure out the perfect way of doing it. Like, that's not the point of it. The point is to go as hard as you possibly can. The point is always to go as hard as you possibly can and understand that your ceiling is oftentimes your recovery. You know, and how you find that line, it just takes effort. It just takes time. It takes trial and error. You know, even as a coach, you know, when you have new athletes, like, everyone will respond different to training. And being drawn by these images of like greater than life people that achieve things doing one thing, you know, can usually be misguided. Like I said, both by, you know, being genetically gifted or the use of PEDs like we've seen throughout the years. And if you go through history, you realize a lot of the times the answer lies somewhere in the middle. And yeah, that's all. All right, and that's the video for this week. So hopefully you guys got something out of it. Like always, please like, subscribe, and comment something. I'll read all the comments here because I don't get that many. But yeah, like the video, helps a lot, and subscribe to the channel. So thank you for watching.
It is important to draw wisdom from many different places. If we take it from only one place, it becomes rigid and stale. Understanding others, the other elements, and the other nations will help you become whole.